A bully slaps an orphaned black girl in broad daylight, just for touching her car. The crowd watches, frozen. The girl stands there, shaking, until one man sees the video online, and everything changes. The next morning, a thunderous roar fills the town. 500 motorcycles roll in, led by a man the world once feared, now riding for faith, not fury. They didn't come for revenge. They came for justice. But when the powerful try to silence them, secrets rise to the surface, old sins, buried lies, and a past that refuses to stay dead. The girl who was humiliated in front of the world might just become the reason an entire town finds its soul again. When love and faith face corruption and hate, how far will one man go to protect the innocent and redeem his own past? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the warm Tennessee sunshine, 12-year-old Amara Johnson walked carefully along Pine Ridge's cracked sidewalks, clutching 2 brown paper grocery bags close to her chest. The weight of canned soup and Miss Lula May's heart medicine made her arms ache, but she didn't mind. Her grandmother needed these supplies, and Amara was determined to get them home safely. The afternoon light painted Main Street in friendly colors, making the shop windows gleam. Amara paused near Wilson's Bakery, drawn by the sweet scent of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. That's when she saw it. A pristine white SUV that sparkled like a diamond under the spring sun. She'd never seen anything so clean and perfect. Without thinking, Amara stepped closer, mesmerized by her own reflection in the vehicle's polished surface. Her braids were coming loose after a long school day, and her second-hand dress looked faded in the mirror-like finish. As she shifted the heavy grocery bags, her elbow barely grazed the side mirror. "Get away from my car!" The shrill voice made Amara jump. Darlene Whitfield burst out of the bakery, her face twisted with anger. Her perfectly styled hair and designer clothes seemed to vibrate with rage. "How dare you touch my vehicle!" Before Amara could stammer an apology, Darlene's hand whipped through the air. The slap cracked across Amara's cheek like lightning, sending her stumbling backward. The grocery bags slipped from her arms, cans clattering across the sidewalk as bread and other items scattered. "You people have no respect for other people's property?" Darlene's voice rose higher, spitting out words that made Amara's heart crumple. Horrible words. Words about color and worth that Miss Lula May had warned her some people still carried in their hearts like poison. Tears burned in Amara's eyes, but she remembered her grandmother's teachings. Stand tall. Keep your dignity. Even as her cheek stung and shame washed over her, Amara forced herself to stay upright, though her lower lip trembled. Around them, people had stopped to stare. A teenage girl with pink-streaked hair held up her phone, recording everything. An elderly man shook his head in disgust, at Darlene, not Amara. A mother pulled her young children close, covering their ears. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean any harm." "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Darlene sneered, but something in Amara's quiet dignity seemed to make her suddenly aware of their audience. She straightened her designer blouse, glancing around with narrowed eyes. Just stay away from my things." Amara knelt to gather the spilled groceries, her hands shaking. A kind-faced woman from the bakery hurried out to help, murmuring gentle words of comfort. But Amara barely heard them. She focused on collecting every can, every item her grandmother needed, trying to hide her tears. The rest of the walk home passed in a blur. By the time Amara reached their small house at the edge of town, her legs felt weak, and her chest ached with suppressed sobs. She placed the groceries in the kitchen as quietly as possible, not wanting to worry Miss Lula May. but her grandmother's intuition was sharp as ever. "Child, what's troubling you?" Amara found her sitting in her favorite chair, Bible open on her lap, reading glasses perched on her nose. The sight of her grandmother's concerned face broke the dam holding back her tears. "Oh, baby girl." Miss Lula May opened her arms, and Amara fell into them, finally letting her sobs break free. The old woman's arms were thin but strong, wrapped around her like a shield against the world's cruelty. "Tell me what happened." Between hiccuping sobs, Amara explained. Miss Lula May listened, one hand stroking Amara's braids while the other held her close. When the story was finished, the old woman didn't speak right away. Instead, she began to pray, her soft voice carrying words of comfort and strength. "Lord, we know you see all things. We know you hold us in your mighty hands. Give this child your peace that passes understanding. Help her forgive those who hurt her and shield her heart from bitterness. Let your love be stronger than hate." Amara's sobs gradually quieted as her grandmother's prayer continued. The familiar words and gentle voice helped ease the sting of humiliation, though the memory of Darlene's face still burned in her mind. Across town, unknown to both Amara and Miss Lula May, the video of the incident was already spreading. The teenage girl with pink hair, whose name was Sarah, had posted it with shaking hands and an angry heart. "This happened in Pine Ridge today," she wrote. "This is not okay." Ride for Amara. The hashtag caught fire faster than anyone could have predicted. Local teens shared it first, then their parents, then people one town over. By nightfall, the video had reached far beyond the boundaries of their small Tennessee town. In her bedroom that night, Amara curled up tight under her worn quilt, listening to the crickets through her open window. Her cheek no longer hurt, but something deeper ached inside her chest. She could hear Miss Lula May in the next room, still praying, her voice a quiet comfort in the darkness. "Lord," Amara whispered her own prayer, tears dampening her pillow. "Help me be strong like Miss Lula May. Help me not to hate. Help me remember what she always says about your love being bigger than any hurt." The night wrapped around the small house like a gentle blanket, while across the digital landscape, a movement was building. People who had never heard of Pine Ridge were sharing the video, expressing outrage, calling for justice. The hashtag Ride for Amara gathered momentum with each passing hour, though the young girl at the center of it all finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that her moment of pain would soon become a catalyst for change. Miss Lula May kept her vigil long into the night, praying not just for Amara, but for Darlene Whitfield too. "Lord," she whispered, "help us all learn to see with your eyes and love with your heart." Her arthritis-curved fingers traced the well-worn pages of her Bible, finding comfort in the familiar verses about love overcoming hatred, light pushing back darkness. The spring night continued on, crickets singing their endless song, while a small town stood unknowingly on the brink of transformation. All because of a brief encounter, a moment of cruelty, and the power of hearts moved to action by witnessing injustice. Morning sunlight streamed through the faded curtains of Amara's small bedroom, but she remained huddled under her quilt, stomach tied in knots. The thought of facing her classmates made her hands shake. What if they'd all seen the video? What if they laughed at her? Worse still, what if she ran into Mrs. Whitfield again? "Amara?" Miss Lula May's gentle voice called from the kitchen. "Your oatmeal's getting cold, baby." Slowly, Amara dragged herself from bed and got dressed, pulling on her cleanest school uniform. In the bathroom mirror, she carefully checked her face. The red mark from yesterday's slap had faded, but she could still feel it burning in her memory. When she finally made her way to the kitchen, Miss Lula May was already seated at their small table, Bible open beside her bowl. She looked up, studying Amara's face with knowing eyes. "I don't want to go," Amara whispered, slumping into her chair. "Maybe I could stay home today? Help you instead?" Miss Lula May reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Amara's trembling ones. "Child, fear is a heavy burden to carry, but you know what's heavier? Letting that fear stop you from living." "But what if everyone's talking about it?" Amara's voice cracked. "What if they've all seen the video?" "Then you walk tall, baby. God walks with you." Miss Lula May's voice carried the strength of decades of faith. "Remember what David wrote in Psalm 27, 'The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?'" Amara nodded, reciting the familiar words along with her grandmother. "The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" "That's right." Miss Lula May smiled, her face creasing with love. "Now eat your oatmeal before it gets any colder." Miles away in Nashville, the morning was taking a different turn. Clay Tanner sat in his mission-run biker chapel, a converted warehouse with wooden crosses and leather-bound Bibles scattered among the chrome and steel decorations. Despite the early hour, he was already on his third cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone. The video appeared on his feed, shared by one of his old riding buddies. Clay's weathered face darkened as he watched the scene unfold. The proud woman's hand flying, the young girl's shocked face, the scattered groceries. His fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white. "Jesus, give me strength," he muttered, then slammed the phone down on his desk hard enough to make his coffee cup rattle. The sound drew the attention of Big Mike, one of his regular volunteers, who poked his head through the office doorway. "Everything okay, Brother Clay?" Clay ran a hand through his gray-streaked beard, trying to calm the anger rising in his chest. "No, brother. Everything is not okay." He picked up the phone again, playing the video for Big Mike. The younger man's face hardened as he watched. "Pine Ridge? That's not but 3 hours from here." "Yeah." Clay stood up, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow across the desk. "Get the word out. Meeting tonight. All hands." By evening, the chapel was packed. 500 reformed bikers filled every available space, their leather vests decorated with crosses instead of gang patches, their faces showing the same mix of concern and controlled anger that Clay felt. Clay stood at the front, the video playing on a large screen behind him. "Brothers," his deep voice carried to every corner of the room. 20 years ago, we were the ones causing trouble. We were the ones people feared. But God changed our hearts. He gave us a new purpose. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Now, I'm watching this video of a grown woman striking a child carrying groceries for her sick grandmother, and I'm thinking about what Jesus said about protecting the least of these." Clay's voice grew stronger. "I'm thinking about how he stood up against the proud and powerful who thought they could mistreat the vulnerable." The room grew silent, every eye fixed on their leader. "That girl needs to know she's not alone. That grandmother needs to know there are still people willing to stand up for what's right." Clay looked around the room, meeting the eyes of men he'd known for decades, men who'd followed him into trouble once, and now followed him in serving God. "We're heading to Pine Ridge. We're going to stand up for the girl God just put in our path." The roar of approval shook the rafters. Men stood, raising their fists, their voices united in purpose. Clay held up his hands for silence. "This isn't about intimidation or revenge," he reminded them. "This is about showing that little girl and her grandmother that they've got brothers and sisters in Christ who care. This is about standing peaceful but firm against injustice. Big Mike stepped forward. When do we ride? Clay checked his phone, noting the weather forecast. Tomorrow morning, first light. Spread the word to the other chapters. Anyone who wants to join us for a peaceful show of support is welcome. As the men began to disperse, making calls and sending messages, Clay returned to his office. He sat heavily in his chair, looking at the cross hanging on his wall. The anger he'd felt earlier had transformed into something else, a sense of purpose, of divine appointment. Lord, he prayed quietly, guide us in this. Help us be your hands and feet. Help us show your love to this child and your truth to this town. Outside his office, the sound of motorcycles starting up filled the air as his brothers headed home to prepare for tomorrow's ride. Clay pulled out his well-worn Bible, turning to the passage that had guided him since his own transformation. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. Isaiah 1:17. The words seemed to glow with new meaning as he thought about the young girl in Pine Ridge, unaware that 500 faithful warriors were about to answer the call to stand beside her. Not with violence or threats, but with the powerful presence of God's love made visible through his people. The morning sun painted the Tennessee sky in soft shades of pink and gold as the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder. At first it sounded like rolling thunder, but soon the distinctive roar of hundreds of engines echoed across the highway, leading into Pine Ridge. Amara sat on the weathered front porch of Miss Lula May's small house, her school books forgotten beside her, as she listened to the growing sound. Miss Lula May rocked gently in her favorite chair, her worn Bible open in her lap. "What is that sound, Miss Lula?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with worry. The elderly woman smiled, reaching over to pat Amara's hand. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Just you wait and see." The rumbling grew stronger, and soon the first motorcycles appeared on Main Street. People began emerging from shops and homes, drawn by the spectacle. The bikes came in waves, hundreds of them, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. American flags and Christian banners fluttered from many of the bikes, and crosses adorned the riders' leather vests. "Sweet Jesus," Miss Lula May whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The convoy of bikes filled Main Street, parking in neat rows that stretched for blocks. Townspeople lined the sidewalks, many holding up phones to record the incredible sight. Some of the bikers were gray-haired, others younger, but all moved with purpose and dignity as they dismounted. From the lead bike, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver-streaked beard removed his helmet. He spoke quietly to several other riders, then made his way toward Miss Lula May's house. His boots clicked against the concrete steps as he approached the porch. Amara instinctively moved closer to Miss Lula May, but something in the man's kind eyes made her pause. He knelt down on one knee before her, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hello, Amara," he said, his deep voice gentle. "I'm Clay Tanner. We saw what happened to you the other day." He gestured to the rows of bikers behind him. "We came to ride for you." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Miss Lula May reached out and squeezed her shoulder. You all came for me?" Amara's voice trembled. Clay nodded solemnly. "You showed real bravery, little one. Standing tall, keeping your dignity, that takes more courage than anything we could do on these bikes." The crowd that had gathered around the house began to clap, the sound swelling until it filled the street. Several of the bikers removed their helmets and bowed their heads in respect. Across the street, inside her boutique's large display window, Darlene Whitfield stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists as she watched the scene unfold. Her face, usually arranged in a practiced smile, twisted with anger and fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. Pine Ridge was her town, her domain. She turned sharply away from the window, pulling out her phone to make some calls. Throughout the day, the bikers maintained a peaceful presence in town. They patronized local businesses, spoke respectfully with residents, and shared their stories with anyone who would listen. Many were former gang members who had found faith and turned their lives around. Their testimony touched hearts and opened minds. As evening approached, the bikers set up camp in the grassy area behind the First Baptist Church. They erected tents and set up a large bonfire, its warm light casting long shadows across the lawn. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the aroma of coffee and grilled food as they prepared for their evening gathering. Clay sat with Amara and Miss Lula May near the fire, sharing stories and songs. Other townspeople gradually joined them, drawn by the warmth and fellowship. Even Pastor Roberts came out to welcome the unexpected visitors. "Brothers and sisters," Clay called out as the sky darkened to deep purple, "let's gather for prayer." The bikers formed a large circle around the fire, joining hands. Many townspeople, moved by the spirit of the moment, joined them. Clay's deep voice carried across the gathering. "Lord, we thank you for bringing us here tonight. We pray for healing in this town. We pray for young Amara, that she'll always remember she's your precious child. We pray for those whose hearts are hardened by pride and fear, that they might find your grace." "Amen," the crowd responded in unison. Amara, standing between Clay and Miss Lula May, felt the strength of hundreds of hands linked in prayer. The firelight danced across faces that just yesterday had been strangers, but now felt like family. She squeezed Clay's rough hand and whispered her own prayer of thanks. The stars emerged one by one above Pine Ridge as songs of praise rose from the circle. Old gospel hymns mixed with contemporary worship songs, creating a melody of hope that echoed through the town. People who had never spoken to each other before found themselves sharing stories and breaking bread together. Miss Lula May, wrapped in a warm blanket provided by one of the bikers' wives, watched it all with grateful tears in her eyes. She had prayed for God to protect her precious Amara, but he had done so much more. He had turned a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for grace, bringing together people from all walks of life to stand against injustice with love instead of hatred. The bonfire continued to burn bright into the night, a beacon of warmth and welcome in a town that was beginning to remember what community truly meant. The bikers maintained a respectful presence, their very existence a reminder that transformation was possible, and that sometimes angels arrived on Harleys instead of wings. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when the first news van pulled into Pine Ridge. By 8 o'clock, the quiet town square buzzed with reporters, their cameras and microphones seemingly everywhere at once. Local stations from Nashville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga converged on the small community, drawn by the viral story of bikers defending a young girl. Main Street transformed into an impromptu media center. Reporters in pressed suits interviewed shop owners, church members, and anyone willing to share their thoughts about the Biker Angels, as social media had dubbed Clay's group. "They've been nothing but respectful," Mrs. Peterson from the diner told Channel 5 News. "They even helped fix my broken screen door yesterday. These aren't troublemakers. They're good people." Clay stood near his motorcycle, surrounded by a cluster of microphones. His weathered face remained calm as cameras rolled, his voice steady and clear. "We didn't come here looking for trouble or revenge," he explained, meeting each reporter's gaze. "We came because a child was hurt, and sometimes people need to be reminded that every person deserves respect and dignity. This isn't about making anyone look bad. It's about healing." Some of his fellow bikers stood nearby, their usual leather vests now bearing crosses and biblical quotes. They nodded in agreement as Clay spoke, their presence both protective and peaceful. Across the street, Darlene Whitfield emerged from her boutique in a carefully chosen powder blue suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She'd called her own press conference, and a different group of reporters gathered around her store's entrance. "These vigilantes have created an atmosphere of fear in our peaceful town," she declared, her voice sharp despite her practiced smile. "They're harassing local businesses and intimidating residents. I've already contacted my lawyers about filing defamation suits." She paused for effect, smoothing her jacket. Furthermore, this incident has brought to light some very concerning issues regarding the child's living situation. I've personally witnessed conditions that no child should endure. The reporters leaned in closer as Darlene lowered her voice dramatically. "I've filed a formal complaint with social services. That poor girl deserves proper care, not life in a run-down house with an elderly woman who can barely care for herself." Back at Miss Lula May's modest home, Amara sat doing her homework at the kitchen table. The afternoon light filtered through worn curtains, casting warm patterns across her notebooks. She could hear Miss Lula May in the next room, talking on the phone, her voice growing increasingly distressed. "Please," Miss Lula May pleaded, before breaking into a violent coughing fit. "You don't understand. Amara needs stability. She needs love. Don't take my baby." Amara's pencil stopped moving. Her heart seemed to freeze in her chest as she listened to her grandmother's coughs and desperate words. Tears blurred her math problems as fear gripped her heart. The same fear she'd felt in every foster home before finding Miss Lula May. The sun had set when Clay's motorcycle rumbled up to their house. He carried 2 large paper bags of groceries, and tucked under his arm was a white pharmacy bag. His boots made the old porch steps creak as he climbed them. "Evening, Miss Lula May," he called softly, finding her in her rocking chair. Her face was tired, but she managed a warm smile. "Brought you some supplies, and that cough medicine the doctor prescribed." "Bless you, Mr. Tanner," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. Amara helped Clay unpack the groceries, carefully arranging cans in the cupboard and fresh vegetables in the refrigerator. Her movements were mechanical, her mind still echoing with her grandmother's phone conversation. "They want to take me away," she finally said, her voice small. "Don't they?" Clay stopped what he was doing and knelt down to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, Amara. No one's taking you anywhere. You hear me? Your grandmother loves you, and you belong right here." "But Mrs. Whitfield..." "Mrs. Whitfield isn't in charge of your life," Clay said firmly. "God put you here with Miss Lula May for a reason. Sometimes people let pride and anger blind them to what's right, but that doesn't mean they get to win." Miss Lula May reached for her Bible on the side table, her hands trembling slightly. "Clay's right, baby. We have to trust in the Lord's plan." They shared a quiet moment together, the kitchen warm with the smell of fresh bread Clay had brought. But the peace was broken by the slow crunch of tires on gravel outside. Through the window, they could see police cars crawling past, their spotlight beams sweeping across the house and yard. Clay moved to the window, his expression grim, as he watched the patrol cars continue toward the church where his fellow bikers camped. The officers were taking photos, their cameras flashing in the growing darkness. "They're trying to build a case," he said quietly. "Make us look like troublemakers. Make your home look unfit." He turned back to Amara and Miss Lula May, his jaw set with determination. "But we're not going anywhere. This isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about standing up for what's right." Miss Lula May reached for both their hands, forming a small circle in the humble kitchen. "Then we'll stand together," she said, her voice stronger despite her illness. "And we'll pray together." As they bowed their heads, more patrol cars rolled past outside, their presence a clear message. The battle lines were drawn in Pine Ridge, But in Miss Lula May's kitchen, 3 people joined in prayer, their faith stronger than their fear. Through the window, the church steeple rose against the darkening sky, and beyond it, the glow of the bikers' campfire could be seen, a reminder that sometimes help comes in unexpected forms, and that God's love can wear a leather jacket. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's town square as Clay Tanner stood on the back of his pickup truck, addressing the crowd gathered before him. His weathered face bore a gentle smile as he looked out at the mix of leather-clad bikers and local townspeople. "Folks, we're not here to cause trouble," he said, his deep voice carrying across the square. "We're here to show what community really means. There's fences that need painting, parks that need cleaning, and hearts that need healing. Who's ready to work?" Hands shot up everywhere, tattooed arms next to business suits, teenagers beside grandmothers. Brother Hank Diesel Malone started handing out paintbrushes, trash bags, and work gloves from the truck bed. "Remember," Clay continued, "today isn't about sides. It's about service. Let's show Pine Ridge what happens when people choose kindness over anger." The crowd broke into smaller groups, spreading out across the town park. Bikers who once terrorized streets now carefully planted flowers alongside church ladies. Local shop owners worked shoulder to shoulder with reformed outlaws, picking up litter and fixing broken benches. Amara Johnson stood near a cooler filled with water bottles, her small hands ready to help. Miss Lula May sat in a folding chair nearby, watching proudly as her granddaughter handed out drinks to thirsty workers. For the first time since the incident, a shy smile played at the corners of Amara's mouth. "Thank you," she whispered to each person who came for water, her voice growing slightly stronger each time. The workers responded with kind words and gentle smiles, making her stand a little taller. Clay worked alongside everyone else, his massive frame bent as he helped scrub graffiti off the park's concrete walls. Sweat darkened his t-shirt as the morning sun climbed higher, but his energy never flagged. He moved from group to group, offering encouragement and sharing stories that made people laugh. "You know," he told a cluster of volunteers while painting a fence, "I used to think strength meant making people fear you. Now I know it's about making them feel valued." News vans began arriving mid-morning, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters walked through the park, capturing footage of the unprecedented scene. Former Hells Angels working peacefully alongside townspeople, their shared purpose bridging old divides. "This is Angela Chen for Channel 5 News," one reporter said into her microphone. "Pine Ridge, Tennessee, has become the unlikely setting for a remarkable story of redemption and community spirit. What began as a response to a viral video of racial discrimination has transformed into something extraordinary." Cameras focused on Amara as she offered water to an elderly man painting a bench. Her smile, though still hesitant, lit up her whole face as the man thanked her and patted her hand. By late afternoon, the park had been transformed. Fresh paint brightened every fence, flowers bloomed in newly weeded beds, and clean playground equipment gleamed in the sun. The transformation wasn't just physical. There was a new warmth between people who had been strangers that morning. As the sun began to set, the crowd moved to the grassy area near the church. Folding chairs appeared, and battery-powered lanterns created pools of soft light. The bikers had set up a simple outdoor stage where several of them tuned guitars and arranged microphones. The evening service began with the rumble of dozens of deep voices singing "Amazing Grace." The sound rolled across the town like thunder, but this was thunder that brought peace instead of fear. More voices joined in, high and low, young and old, blending in harmony. Clay stood before the gathering, his large frame silhouetted against the dying sun. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice gentle despite its power, Tonight we talk about something harder than any work we did today. We talk about forgiveness." A hush fell over the crowd as he continued. "I've seen hate up close, lived it, breathed it, let it poison my soul for years, and I'm here to tell you, you can't fight hate with hate, brothers and sisters. You fight it with grace." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Grace isn't weak. It's the strongest force there is. It's what changes hearts. It's what heals wounds. It's what turned a bunch of outlaws into servants of God." Unknown to most of the gathered crowd, a sleek black car was parked in the shadows of a nearby street. Inside, Darlene Whitfield gripped her steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, watching the scene through, narrowed eyes. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the bitter lines around her mouth as she saw person after person nodding at Clay's words. She snatched up her phone, punching in a number with manicured nails. "Richard?" she snapped when her husband answered. "Are you seeing this circus? They're making me look like the villain while they play at being saints." She listened for a moment, her face growing harder. "No, that's not good enough. You're a councilman. Use your pull. Find a way to shut down their little mission work. Health codes, zoning laws, whatever it takes." Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "If you can't handle this, Richard, maybe it's time voters learned about certain creative bookkeeping in the town's accounts." As she spoke, the sound of gospel music floated through her car windows. The congregation had begun singing again, their voices raised in joy and hope. But for Darlene, each note felt like a personal affront, each word of praise a challenge to her authority in Pine Ridge. She ended the call and sat in her dark car, watching as Amara joined the singers on stage, her small voice growing stronger as she sang words her grandmother had taught her. The sight of the community rallying around the girl made Darlene's perfectly manicured fingers drum against the steering wheel, plotting her next move in the growing conflict. The morning sun cast long shadows across Miss Lula May's worn front porch as two Child Protective Services agents climbed the creaking steps. Their polished shoes and crisp blazers looked out of place against the weathered wood and peeling paint. Amara watched from behind the screen door, her small hands gripping the edge of her grandmother's dress. Miss Lula May stood tall despite her frail frame, opening the door with dignity. "Good morning," the lead agent said, her voice professionally neutral. "I'm Mrs. Porter from Child Protective Services, and this is my colleague, Mr. Jensen. We're here for a home evaluation." Miss Lula May nodded gracefully. "Please come in. We've been expecting you." The agent's heels clicked against the hardwood floors as they entered. Mrs. Porter's eyes immediately went to the water stain on the ceiling, while Mr. Jensen pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "How long have you lived in this house, Miss Johnson?" Mrs. Porter asked, running a finger along a crack in the wall. 47 years, Miss Lula May answered proudly. "Raised 3 generations here, including my own children." Mrs. Porter made a non-committal sound, jotting something down. "And the plumbing? When was it last updated?" "The bathroom sink was fixed last spring," Miss Lula May said, but her voice wavered slightly as she caught the agents exchanging glances. They moved through the house like investigators at a crime scene. Every loose floorboard, every patch of old wallpaper, every outdated appliance became evidence in their silent prosecution. Amara followed them, her heart pounding as she watched, them document her home's imperfections. In the kitchen, Mr. Jensen opened the refrigerator. "Food supplies seem adequate," he noted, but his tone suggested this was a small victory in a losing battle. Mrs. Porter paused by Amara's bedroom door. "May we?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Amara's room was small but neat, with a carefully made bed and school books stacked on a second-hand desk. Bible verses written in careful handwriting decorated the walls, along with drawings of angels and flowers. "You're doing well in school?" Mrs. Porter asked Amara directly. Yes, ma'am, Amara replied softly. I got all A's last term. She's top of her class, Miss Lula May added proudly. Show them your honor roll certificate, baby. Amara retrieved the certificate from her desk drawer, holding it out like a shield. Mrs. Porter glanced at it briefly before returning to her notes. The inspection lasted 2 hours. By the end, Miss Lula May's dignity was still intact, but her energy was failing. She sank into her favorite chair, trying to hide her labored breathing. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Porter said at the door. The department will review our findings. As they turned to leave, Amara couldn't hold back anymore. She ran to her grandmother, wrapping her arms around her neck. Please, she whispered to the agents, please don't take me away. The agents paused, and for a moment, something like doubt crossed Mrs. Porter's face. But then she straightened her blazer and continued down the steps to where their government car waited. Across the street, Clay watched from the shadow of an oak tree, his heart heavy. Once the CPS car pulled away, he headed back to the mission tent that had become command central for his crew. Inside, dozens of bikers sat on folding chairs, their leather vests now adorned with crosses alongside their old patches. The air was thick with purpose and prayer as Clay spread old court documents across a makeshift table. Brother Marcus, Clay called to a former accountant-turned-biker, what do you make of these numbers? Marcus adjusted his reading glasses, studying the papers. These are city budget reports from 2015 through 2020. Something's not right with the low-income housing allocations. Clay nodded grimly. Keep digging. Hours passed as they pored over documents, connecting dots that painted an ugly picture. As the sun set, Clay gathered the most damning evidence into a folder. I need to see Daniel, he told his crew. Keep praying, brothers. This fight's far from over. Sheriff Daniel Hayes was working late at the station, as he often did these days. He looked up as Clay entered, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. Never thought I'd see you walking in here voluntarily, Hayes said, leaning back in his chair. Clay set the folder on the sheriff's desk. Never thought I'd be bringing you evidence instead of giving you alibis. Hayes opened the folder, his expression growing serious as he read. Richard Whitfield's fingerprints are all over this, he said finally. Money meant for low-income housing repairs, redirected to private accounts. Including Miss Lula May's neighborhood, Clay added. Those repairs CPS is complaining about should have been fixed years ago with city funds. Hayes rubbed his face tiredly. Clay, you're poking a hornet's nest here. The Whitfields have friends in every office that matters. They play dirty in Pine Ridge politics. Clay leaned forward, his voice low and intense. So did I once. Now I play for God. He tapped the folder. All I'm asking is for you to verify these files, make sure everything's legal and proper. And then what? Then we let the truth do what truth does best, set things right. Hayes studied his old friend for a long moment. The man before him was a far cry from the wild-eyed biker he'd chased in their younger days. There was something different in Clay's eyes now, not just determination, but peace. Give me 48 hours, Hayes finally said. I'll make some calls, check some records. But Clay? He held up a warning finger. Do this by the book. No vigilante justice, not even for a good cause. Clay nodded, standing to leave. The only power I'm calling on these days comes from above, Daniel, but make no mistake, it's the strongest power there is. As Clay walked out of the sheriff's office, the weight of Amara's future pressed heavy on his shoulders. He'd seen the fear in her eyes today, watched her cling to her grandmother like a lifeline. It reminded him of another little girl, long ago, who'd lost everything to the system. Back at the mission tent, his crew was still hard at work, their Bibles open alongside legal documents. They looked up as he entered, questions in their eyes. "We wait," Clay said simply. "And we pray. Sometimes the hardest part of God's work is letting him work in his own time." The bikers nodded, understanding in their faces. They'd all learned that lesson the hard way, trading their old impatience for faith's slower, surer path. As night settled over Pine Ridge, Clay could see the lights on in Miss Lula May's house. He pictured Amara and her grandmother praying together, holding on to each other and their faith. His own prayer was simple but fierce. "Lord, you brought us here for a reason. Show us the way to make this right." The Saturday morning sun painted Pine Ridge's main street in shades of gold. Clay stood beside his gleaming Harley, watching his crew line up their bikes in perfect formation. The chrome sparkled, and leather vests rustled as nearly 500 bikers prepared for what they were calling the Ride of Honor. At Miss Lula May's house, Amara stood on the porch in her freshly pressed school uniform, her braids tied with new blue ribbons. Her grandmother adjusted her backpack straps, whispering prayers and encouragement. "Remember, baby, you walk with the Lord," Miss Lula May said, her voice thin but strong. She looked tired. This morning, more pale than usual, but her smile remained bright. Clay walked up the creaky steps and knelt before Amara. "Ready for your first motorcycle ride, little one?" Amara nodded, though her hands twisted nervously in front of her. "Will it be scary?" "Not with me," Clay promised, his voice gentle. "I've been riding longer than you've been alive. Plus," he winked, "I hear angels like to ride along sometimes too." That earned him a small smile. Clay helped her put on a child-sized leather vest his crew had gotten made special, with "Honorary Angel" stitched in blue thread on the back. The sound of hundreds of motorcycles starting up filled the morning air. Clay lifted Amara onto his bike, making sure she was secure behind him. "Hold tight to my jacket, okay?" "Yes, sir," she said, her small hands gripping the leather. Miss Lula May watched from the porch, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Look at all these angels you sent." The procession began moving, Clay's bike in the lead. The rumble of engines echoed off storefronts as they made their way through town. People lined the sidewalks, many holding up phones to record the moment. Children jumped and waved, their parents watching with mixed expressions of awe and curiosity. Outside the bakery, where everything had started just days ago, a group of reporters clustered with cameras. Clay noticed Amara tense behind him, but then something unexpected happened. The baker himself came out, holding up a hand-painted sign that read, "God bless Amara." Others followed his lead, revealing similar signs they'd been hiding. Even some of the most skeptical townsfolk found themselves clapping as the procession passed. The sight of a small black girl, sitting tall behind a gruff-looking biker, surrounded by hundreds more who'd come just to support her. It broke through barriers that words alone couldn't touch. At Pine Ridge Elementary, the bikers formed an honor guard along the walkway. Amara walked between them, her head held high despite her trembling hands. Clay walked beside her, his presence both protection and encouragement. Inside her classroom, Amara froze in the doorway. Her desk was covered with cards, dozens of them, handmade with crayons and glitter and love. Her classmates surrounded her, offering hugs and showing her their artwork. "We're sorry we didn't stop it," one girl said, pressing a card decorated with hearts into Amara's hands. "But we're not scared anymore," added another boy. "Those bikers are so cool." Clay watched from the hallway as Amara's teacher, Mrs. Martinez, wiped away tears. "Thank you," she mouthed to him over the children's heads. The morning passed peacefully, but peace never lasted long in Pine Ridge these days. When Clay brought Amara home after school, they found Miss Lula May collapsed on the porch swing, her prayer book fallen beside her. "Grandma!" Amara's scream cut through the afternoon quiet. Clay rushed forward, checking Miss Lula May's pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. "Call 911, he shouted to his crew members who were never far away. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for the ambulance. Amara held her grandmother's hand, whispering the Bible verses they'd memorized together. Clay stood guard, his heart breaking at the sight. The ambulance arrived with lights flashing, followed closely by curious neighbors. As the paramedics worked, Clay lifted Amara into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. "She'll be okay, little one," he murmured, though worry gnawed at his gut. "We'll pray, and we'll believe." They followed the ambulance to Pine Ridge General Hospital, a steady stream of bikers falling in behind them. In the emergency room waiting area, Clay sat with Amara while his crew filled the chairs and hallway, creating a wall of protective presence. Across town, in a dimly lit office at the county courthouse, Darlene Whitfield sat across from Commissioner Gerald Thompson. Her perfect manicure tapped against his desk as she spoke in urgent whispers. "Surely you can see how dangerous this situation has become," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "All these criminals surrounding a vulnerable child, and now her grandmother's health is failing. We have a moral obligation to intervene." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "The bikers haven't caused any trouble, Darlene. In fact, crime's down since they arrived." "That's not the point." Darlene leaned forward, her eyes hard despite her pleasant smile. "Think of your re-election, Gerald. Think of how it would look if something happened to that poor child under your watch. Besides," she added, sliding a folder across his desk, "I've taken the liberty of gathering evidence about the inadequate conditions of her current living situation." The commissioner opened the folder, frowning at its contents. Meanwhile, on televisions across Pine Ridge, the evening news played footage of that morning's ride. Viewers watched as hundreds of bikers escorted one small girl to school, their faces softening at the sight of her brave smile. But in the hospital waiting room, Amara didn't see any of that coverage. She sat curled against Clay's side, her prayers now silent, but her lips still moving. Clay kept his arm around her shoulders, his own prayers joining hers in the quiet hospital air. 3 days passed like molasses at Pine Ridge General Hospital. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights created an artificial world where time seemed to stand still. Miss Lula May lay in room 312, her usual vibrancy dimmed by machines and monitors that beeped a steady rhythm. Amara refused to leave her grandmother's side. She curled up in the navy blue waiting chair, her small frame dwarfed by its bulk. Her worn Bible, its pages dog-eared and marked with colorful tabs, never left her hands. Sometimes she read aloud in whispers, her voice carrying familiar verses to her grandmother's ears. "The Lord is my shepherd," she would begin, her voice trembling but determined. The nurses grew used to working around her, their hearts melting at the sight of such devotion. They brought extra blankets and pillows, trying to make the institutional chair more comfortable for overnight stays. Clay came every day without fail, his heavy boots echoing down the sterile hallways. He always brought something. Bright tulips one day, cheerful daisies the next, and always a thermos of hot cocoa made just the way Amara liked it, with extra marshmallows floating on top. "How's our warrior today?" he would ask, settling his large frame into the visitor's chair beside Amara. She would give him a tired smile, accepting the warm drink with grateful hands. "Grandma squeezed my hand this morning," she'd say. Or, "The doctor says her heart rhythm is getting stronger." On the 4th morning, as Clay walked through the hospital parking lot with another bouquet of flowers, a man in an expensive suit approached him. "Mr. Tanner, you've been served." He thrust a thick envelope into Clay's free hand and hurried away. Clay stood there, flowers in one hand and legal papers in the other, reading through pages of legal jargon. Darlene Whitfield's name jumped out at him, along with words like defamation and incitement to riot. The lawsuit claimed he had deliberately orchestrated a campaign to destroy her reputation and business interests. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the biker camp. That evening, as the sun set and the parking lot lights flickered to life, tension crackled through the group gathered there. Many of the men paced, their faces dark with anger. "We could pay her a visit," one suggested, cracking his knuckles. "Show her what real intimidation looks like." "Yeah," another agreed. "We've been playing nice, but maybe nice ain't working." Clay stood on the bed of his pickup truck, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Brothers, gather round." The men formed a circle, their faces lit by the harsh fluorescent lights above. Some wore their leather cuts, others just jeans and t-shirts, but all carried the weight of their past lives in their stance and scars. "I know you're angry," Clay began, his deep voice steady. "I am too, but our fight isn't with fists anymore. Those days are behind us." A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. "Remember why we're here," Clay continued. "We came to stand up for a little girl who needed defenders. But what kind of defenders would we be if we proved Darlene right? If we showed Amara that violence is the answer?" He looked around at the faces of men he'd known for years, men who'd followed him through hell and back. "We'll win this the right way, with truth, with dignity, with the kind of strength that doesn't leave bruises but changes hearts." The men grew quiet, some nodding slowly as his words sank in. Later that night, Clay met with Sheriff Hayes in the hospital cafeteria. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their coffee cups as Hayes slid a manila folder across the table. "You were right about Darlene," the sheriff said, his voice low. "She's been running quite an operation. The Ladies' Civic Club Charity Fund? Most of it's been going straight into offshore accounts. She's been skimming from every fundraiser, every donation drive." Clay flipped through bank statements and transaction records. "How long?" "Years," Hayes replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "She's got half the town council in her pocket. That's why nobody's touched her." They spent hours planning their next moves, knowing they needed to be careful. One wrong step could bring everything crashing down. "We'll need solid proof," Hayes said. "Documentation that'll stand up in court, and we'll need to protect our sources." Clay nodded, understanding the delicate nature of their investigation. "We'll do this by the book, Daniel. No shortcuts." As midnight approached, Clay made his way back up to Miss Lula May's room. The night shift nurses nodded to him as he passed, used to his presence at all hours. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Miss Lula May lay peaceful against white sheets, her breathing steady under the oxygen mask. Amara had finally fallen asleep, her head resting on the edge of the bed, one hand still holding her grandmother's, the other clutching her Bible. Clay moved quietly into the room, draping his jacket over Amara's shoulders. Her face, even in sleep, held a trace of worry that no 12-year-old should have to carry. "We'll get you home, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you, that's a promise." He settled into the other chair, preparing for another night watch. Outside the window, dozens of motorcycles gleamed under the parking lot lights, their riders keeping vigil in their own way. In the quiet hospital room, with its steady beeping monitors and whispered prayers, a different kind of battle plan was taking shape. One fought not with fists or threats, but with truth, justice, and unwavering faith. The night stretched on, each hour marked by the quiet footsteps of nurses doing their rounds, the soft whoosh of the oxygen machine, and the silent prayers of a man who had once led with violence, but now chose to lead with grace. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's main street as Clay walked into the offices of the Pine Ridge Herald. Under his arm, he carried a thick manila envelope filled with documents that would change everything. Sarah Chen, the newspaper's lead investigative reporter, was already waiting for him, 2 cups of coffee steaming on her desk. "This better be good," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You don't usually see reformed bikers walking into newspaper offices at 7 in the morning." Clay carefully laid out the evidence: bank statements, transfer records, and photographs of falsified charity documents. "The Whitfields have been stealing from their own community for years," he explained, his voice steady. "Every fundraiser, every donation drive, they've been taking most of it for themselves." Sarah's eyes widened as she examined the papers. "This is extensive," she said, spreading the documents across her desk. "We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars." "More like millions," Clay corrected, "and it goes back at least 15 years. 2 days later, the story exploded across Pine Ridge. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Councilman and wife linked to charity fraud." The article detailed years of systematic theft from community programs, senior centers, and youth organizations. By noon, dozens of protesters had gathered outside the Whitfields' mansion, their signs demanding justice. "Where's our money?" one read. "Thieves in designer clothes," declared another. The crowd grew larger as the day wore on, their angry voices carrying across the manicured lawns. Inside her boutique, Darlene Whitfield's hands shook as she made a phone call. Her perfectly maintained facade was cracking. "Do it," she hissed into the phone. "Release the photo, destroy him." That afternoon, local news stations interrupted their regular programming. A grainy mugshot from 1983 filled the screens. Clay Tanner, younger and harder, his eyes cold, his face twisted in a sneer. The caption read, "Leader of protest movement has violent criminal past." Darlene appeared on camera, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "This man has been terrorizing our town," she said. "He's using that poor child as a shield for his criminal activities. He's dangerous. Just look at his record." The police arrived at the biker camp as the sun was setting. Sheriff Hayes looked pained as he approached Clay, holding a warrant. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There's an outstanding bench warrant from 1983. I have to bring you in." Clay nodded, understanding. He'd known this might happen. "Let me say goodbye to Amara first." The 12-year-old girl ran from Miss Lula May's hospital room when she heard the news. "No!" she cried, throwing herself into Clay's arms. "You can't leave! Everyone leaves!" Clay knelt down, his eyes level with hers. The setting sun through the hospital windows painted them both in soft orange light. "Listen to me, sweetheart," he said gently. "This is temporary. I'm not leaving you. Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost, but God knows what he's doing." Tears streamed down Amara's face as the handcuffs clicked around Clay's wrists. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Keep praying, little one," Clay called over his shoulder as the officers led him away. "Faith moves mountains." Later that night, the hospital corridor grew quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Amara sat beside Miss Lula May's bed, holding her grandmother's frail hand. The old woman's breathing had become more labored, her skin taking on a grayish tint. The overhead lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, her lips moving in desperate prayer. "Please, God," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines. "Don't take her too. I can't lose anyone else. Please." Miss Lula May's monitor began beeping faster, its rhythm irregular and threatening. A nurse rushed in, checking vital signs with quick, practiced movements. She pressed the emergency call button, and suddenly the quiet room burst into activity as medical staff flooded in. Amara found herself pushed to the corner, watching helplessly as doctors and nurses worked over her grandmother. The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, Amara clutched her Bible closer, her prayers becoming more urgent. "Please, God," she whispered again, tears falling onto the worn leather cover. "Please don't take her too." Dawn crept over Pine Ridge with a heavy gray mist. In room 312 of Memorial Hospital, the morning shift nurse made her rounds, checking on patients as the sun struggled to break through the clouds. When she reached Miss Lula May's room, she paused, noticing the unusual stillness. Amara had fallen asleep in the chair beside her grandmother's bed, her small hand still clasping Miss Lula May's. The nurse approached quietly, checking the monitors. No beeping broke the morning silence. With gentle fingers, she felt for a pulse, then bowed her head. Miss Lula May Johnson had passed peacefully in her sleep, her face serene, her Bible resting on her chest. At the county jail, Clay sat on his bunk, praying his morning prayers when Sheriff Hayes appeared at his cell. The sheriff's face told the story before his words could. "Clay," he said softly, "Miss Lula May, she's gone." Clay's shoulders began to shake. For the first time since his conversion years ago, tears streamed freely down his weathered face. His large frame seemed to collapse in on itself as he pressed his palms against his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why now? Why her?" Outside the jail, word spread quickly among the bikers who had maintained their vigil. They gathered closer, holding candles despite the morning light. Someone had spray-painted "Faith Still Rides" on a banner hanging from the building across the street. The flames flickered beneath those words as the men bowed their heads in prayer. Sheriff Hayes worked through the morning, making calls and checking records. By mid-afternoon, he had confirmation. The warrant that had led to Clay's arrest had been cleared years ago through a clerical error. He marched into the judge's chambers with the evidence, demanding Clay's immediate release. "This man's been wrongfully held," Hayes insisted, his voice firm. "And there's a little girl out there who needs him right now." The sound of motorcycles filled the air as Clay walked out of the jail. Hundreds of bikes lined the street, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. His men had refused to leave, standing guard through the night, through the rain, through their own doubts. Clay stepped into the street, overwhelmed by their loyalty. These men, former outlaws, reformed sinners, brothers in faith, surrounded him with embraces and prayers. The rumble of engines became a roar of welcome. In the middle of the street, Clay dropped to his knees. His voice, usually so strong, came out as a whisper. "Forgive me, Lord, for losing faith, even for a moment." His brothers formed a circle around him, hands on his shoulders, their own prayers joining his. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Pine Ridge Cemetery spread out under ancient oaks, their branches creating patterns of light and shadow on the grass. A small group gathered around a fresh grave, the minister's words carrying on the morning breeze. Amara stood alone at the front, her small frame straight and still. She wore the dress Miss Lula May had made her for Easter, pressed carefully the night before. Her hands clutched a single white rose, her grandmother's favorite. The minister was reading from Psalms when the first distant rumble of engines reached them. It grew louder, closer, until the sound filled the cemetery. Around the curve of the road came Clay, leading a procession of bikes, each rider carrying flowers. They parked in perfect formation and dismounted in silence. Clay, wearing a clean black shirt and carrying an armful of white roses, walked to where Amara stood. Without a word, he knelt beside her, placing the flowers on Miss Lula May's grave. One by one, the bikers followed, each adding their flowers to the growing blanket of white. These tough men, with their leather and tattoos, moved with surprising grace, many wiping tears from their eyes as they remembered the kind old woman who had welcomed them with sweet tea and Bible verses. Clay remained kneeling beside Amara, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. The minister continued the service, his words now accompanied by the soft whisper of leather jackets and the quiet sniffling of grieving bikers who had come to pay their respects to a woman who had shown them what true faith looked like. The white roses trembled in Clay's weathered hands as he placed them gently on Miss Lula May's grave. Each flower seemed to glow against the dark earth, just like their recipient's spirit had brightened every life she touched. Beside him, Amara's small frame shook with sobs she could no longer contain. She turned and buried her face in Clay's leather jacket, her tears soaking into the worn material. "She loved you so much, baby girl," Clay whispered, wrapping his arms around her. His own voice was thick with emotion as he held her close, letting her grief pour out. After the final prayers, as people began to drift away, Clay noticed Darlene Whitfield standing beneath a distant oak tree. She wore a black dress and carried herself, stiffly, uncertainty visible in her stance. Clay gently patted Amara's shoulder and walked over to where Darlene stood. "You came," he said softly, no accusation in his voice. Darlene's perfectly made-up face couldn't hide her inner turmoil. Clay looked at her with compassion rather than judgment. "You can still do the right thing," he said quietly. "God's not done with you yet." Darlene's lips trembled, but she turned away without speaking, her heels clicking rapidly across the cemetery grounds. In her car, she sat gripping the steering wheel, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her hands shook as the weight of her actions pressed down on her conscience. As evening approached, the rumble of motorcycles filled Pine Ridge once again. Clay had gathered his brothers for one final ride, a tribute to Miss Lula May. Each biker carried flowers, their leather jackets adorned with white ribbons. At the front of the formation, Amara sat behind Clay on his bike, Miss Lula May's favorite floral scarf wrapped around her shoulders. It fluttered in the wind like a banner of remembrance. The townspeople lined the streets in respectful silence as the procession passed. Some held candles, others bowed their heads in prayer. The sunset painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as the bikers rode through town, their engines a deep, rolling thunder. A final salute to a woman whose love had changed them all. The morning sun painted Pine Ridge in shades of gold as Clay led a small group of bikers down the quiet streets. Their engines purred softly, almost reverently, as they approached Darlene Whitfield's grand white house. The perfectly manicured lawn glittered with dew as Clay dismounted his motorcycle, holding a single red rose. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked up to the porch. Behind him, Amara followed, her small hands trembling as she clutched another rose. The wooden steps creaked beneath their feet as they reached Darlene's door. Clay placed his rose first, its deep red petals a stark contrast against the pristine white paint. Amara stepped forward, her braids swaying gently in the morning breeze. She laid her rose next to Clay's, then straightened up, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "I forgive you," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. The door opened slowly, revealing Darlene. Her usual perfect composure crumbled at the sight of the roses and the child she had wronged. Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed to her knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry." In the days that followed, Pine Ridge witnessed more changes. The courthouse buzzed with activity as Clay officially became Amara's legal guardian. The old church, where it all began, transformed into Lula's haven, a sanctuary for children and veterans alike, just as Miss Lula May would have wanted. On a warm afternoon, the church parking lot rang with children's laughter. Amara, now, confident and smiling, helped younger kids balance on their bicycles. Clay worked nearby, his hands busy with motorcycle repairs, but his eyes kept drifting proudly to his daughter. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lot, Amara paused to watch the horizon. The setting sun caught the chrome of distant motorcycles, making them sparkle like stars. A soft smile crossed her face as she whispered, "They said angels had wings, but mine ride Harleys." Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.